As a fan of time travel fiction, I fantasize about having experiences like Manitobans in the past would have had. So here I am at a train station, a traveling salesman, waiting to move on to the next town to sell my wares. And that would be the way that I would do business, is traveling from town to town by train. It's an experience I can't have anymore because of a fundamental change in the way we have public transportation.
I'm Gordon Goldsborough, head researcher for the Manitoba Historical Society, radio and newspaper columnist, and author of books on the neglected, the overlooked, the hidden places from Manitoba's past. Join me in this series as we explore back roads to places that tell great stories about how things used to be and how we've ended up where we are today. This is Abandoned Manitoba. Today, I'm in Portage la Prairie to meet with James Kostuchuk. He's a retired high school history teacher and an avid local historian. James is going to share with me some of Portage's rich railway history that centers around its two impressive stations, both over 100 years old.
Hey, I'm so glad you could come out to Portage la Prairie today, Gord.
Well, thank you for having me. I've always wanted to be able to learn more about this station because it's really a rarity to see a station in such great shape. You know, this is what they called a second-class station, which doesn't mean it was in any way inferior, but it meant it was serving a smaller community. And I think this is really neat because what it shows, I think, what I see right here is some of the sandstone that they used on the exterior. That was kind of uncommon. I think most of the stations either used other types of stone or they used bricks, or they used wood in a lot of cases. And a lot of the stations didn't survive as a result.
And Portage la Prairie has not one, but two stations that are still not in use for how they were designed, but the buildings are still standing.
Well, and that's remarkable too, because it had the two railway lines running through it. Most towns had one railway line. You had either CP or CN, but Portage had both.
Having both Canadian Pacific and Canadian National Railway stations at Portage la Prairie meant that the city, at the turn of the 20th century, was seen as a major stopping place. It was ripe for development, with its railway stations as centers of activity.
I think it's also worth mentioning, while you're talking about transport, is that not only are we here for a hub of the railway, but as you know, it was also a hub for ox cart travel in the 1870s when people were heading west. And so for those people that live in Winnipeg, you have Portage Avenue, which was the ox cart trail to Portage. And then our main thoroughfare is Saskatchewan Avenue, which was the ox cart trail to Saskatchewan. But even before the settlers from this area right here, it was part of the Yellow Quilt Trail system. And Indigenous people would walk to their communities using networks of trails that still exist here today.
So tell me, James, this building is no longer in use as a railway station.
Right.
If nothing else, we get that sense from the fact that there's a big chain link fence preventing you from accessing the train tracks. What is it being used for today?
So in the 1990s, a group of concerned citizens formed Portage Heritage Incorporated, and they took ownership of this building. And since then, they've been doing, a meticulous restoration of both the interior and the exterior. And right now, they're working on a process of putting in a kitchen and some facilities so that they can not only use it as a railway museum and for the model railroading group in Portage la Prairie, but then it could also be rented for public events. So that's their plan to keep this station viable into the future. Because at the end of the day, they want to raise enough funds to make sure that they can keep it in good order.
And that's the key, I think. And in an old building, unless it's maintained, unless it's used, well, the reality is it'll deteriorate until somebody says, let's tear it down because there's nothing else to do.
Yes, and it's a sad thing to say, but if we look at it as a business model, there are over 200 railway museums in Canada, and there's even 2 in Portage la Prairie, and so it's in a sense a saturated market. So the struggle that a lot of these small museums are having, like railway museums, is to find sustainability, and really repurposing is the answer. You have to find a way to derive enough revenue from the building to help pay your bills.
Right.
And that's what they're trying to do here.
That's right, yeah.
So Gord, can you tell me why you think this rail station has really stood the test of time?
Well, I think it's because it was built to be durable. You know, it was built out of materials that last. You know, it's built out of stone, it's built out of bricks. So many of the smaller stations especially would be built out of wood, which of course doesn't have the same durability as brick or stone. But the other thing about the wooden ones is that they were lighter and therefore could be moved. You know, the fact that this one probably couldn't ever be moved just because it would be so heavy is why it's still on its original spot. Whereas a lot of the smaller stations, the wood stations, they would pick them up, move them somewhere else, and turn them into people's homes, for example.
As we walked up to the CN station, though, it was clear from its appearance that time has not been kind to the former transportation hub.
So there's not many places in Manitoba that you find two railway stations. How come Portage has two?
Well, you have to, at the time period when the people were, moving west and settlement was happening across the prairies, Portage la Prairie is one of the major stops. Of course, as you know, we had Fort Lorraine in the 18th century, and so that was really with Portage to Lake Manitoba. And so that kind of transport narrative carried on with the railway and bringing the settlers here. And so we had both CNR and CPR. Yeah. And I think I mentioned to you, one of the few places in Canada that has a diamond crossing. Right. And that's where the two lines actually cross. Yeah. But, this building has a different story to the other building. Yeah. And it's also a building that we might say is at risk. And I think you had noticed that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it obviously looks very different from the other building. It's a newer building, so it isn't quite as architecturally grand as the other one. It still has its nice elements. It's got that strip of limestone at the bottom and then bricks, but it doesn't have the flourishes over the doors and windows that the other one had. But yes, you're right. This one, well, I mean, obviously you can see that it's not in active use. The windows are all boarded up. The doors are boarded up. There's vegetation growing in the eaves troughs. The roof looks in serious trouble. Like, it's got some areas where there are no shingles left, which means the water can then infiltrate, and that's never a good thing for old buildings, is when you get water coming in from the roof.
Given the strategic location of Portage la Prairie on two major east-west rail lines, I was not surprised to see numerous freight trains pass through the city during my visit. However, one of the trains was not carrying freight. James and I were surprised to see one of the trains roll to a stop in front of the old CN station. It was a blast from the past, a passenger train, and it was stopping to pick up a passenger bound for northern Manitoba. Now that's surely something you don't see much anymore.
Of course, at one time, everybody took the train. So there must have been some pretty noteworthy people who stopped in Portage, weren't there?
Absolutely. Perhaps the most famous for people who are into movies is Clark Gable visited in 1938. He came out to hunt at Delta with Jimmy Robinson. And there's photos of Clark Gable walking on this platform behind us when he came. We have pictures of soldiers returning from war to this platform and meeting their loved ones. And in the 1960s, they even brought trainloads of kindergarten students to Portage to spend the day in Island Park. Queen Elizabeth II came as well. But perhaps the most famous visitor to this rail station was King George VI and Queen Mary. In 1939, they were traveling across Canada, and they decided that they wanted to attend a church service. And the nearest church for them to attend happened to be in Portage la Prairie. So they stopped, and the King and Queen got out of the train right where you're standing, and they got in a convertible, and they took their car on Campbell Street to Trinity United, what is now Trinity United Church, and attended service and came back. And once the royal couple left, they actually renamed Campbell Street to Royal Road.
Well, that's what I was wondering, because I looked over there and I thought, no, it's not called Campbell. It's called, oh, I get it.
Yeah,
That's
and,
cool.
And to people of a certain age, this place is very familiar to them.
Yeah. Wow, that's neat.
As I left Portage la Prairie that afternoon, I wondered how much longer the old CN station will remain standing. With land values rising, disused relics of the past, like this boarded-up railway station, are in peril.
When the railway stations in places like Portage la Prairie closed, there really wasn't much to be done. They couldn't be moved anywhere. As opposed to the smaller stations, the small wooden ones in little towns that were easily turned into some other purpose, they would be either renovated right where they stood or they'd be picked up and moved. One of my friends who's been out traveling the countryside told me that the railway station at Greenway was one such railway station, that when it closed in 1959, the building was sold and it was moved to be someone's home. And they said it was 2 miles north of Greenway, but well, I followed my instructions on my map here and it says I'm supposed to be there now, but I don't see any railway station. The only thing I can imagine, perhaps, is that there's a bunch of trees over there and there looks like there's maybe a road kind of driving over there. I don't know if I want to drive in there though. I mean, I don't know if it's going to be soft. I could get stuck. And of course, I'm also trespassing too, so I really don't want to do that. So I think this is maybe a place for the drone. I'm just going up a little ways and I can see that there's a bluff of trees surrounding what perhaps at one time was a home site. There is a pond. There is, well, it looks like maybe, I don't know, beehives maybe? There's a whole bunch of them anyway. There's some granaries. I don't see any building that looks like a railway station, but let's go ahead and see. Maybe it's kind of hiding there in the nook of the trees. Oh, you know what? The building is gone. Well, I guess we're skunked. You know, sometimes this is the way it goes. You know, you find some real treasure and sometimes, well, you don't. Luckily in this case, we do have another option. When they built the station at Greenway, they built apparently its twin at Balder. That Balder station later closed and it was moved to the grounds of the Manitoba Agricultural Museum. So we can go and check it out there and it'll be virtually the same as the one that was at Greenway.
Increasingly, the place you go today to see a railway station is not along the track through a city, but in a museum. In this case, we're at the Manitoba Agricultural Museum near Austin, where there's an entire village of historic buildings like ones you would see anywhere in Manitoba at the turn of the 20th century, including several houses, 2 schools, a store, 2 churches, a post office, and, of course, a grain elevator. Near that elevator is a beautifully preserved railway station that was brought to the museum grounds in 1975.
This nicely preserved 4th-class station house began its life in the village of Balder back in 1893. When it was operating as a station, the first part of the building was where the staff would have worked, selling tickets to the train, maybe receiving telegrams and other communications, and then next to it was the waiting area. So if you were taking a train, if you had bought a ticket, you would sit here waiting for the train to arrive. And of course, if this was winter, you might get a little chilly in here, so you'd have a pot-bellied stove to keep you warm. Then moving beyond, we go back into the private area of the station. Again, that's where they would keep things like the valuables that had arrived, mail, for instance. Maybe they would keep some of the other valuables that had arrived, things that needed to be kept away from prying eyes. And then beyond that was the general freight area. You know, so anything that had arrived for some of the local farmers, maybe the goods for the local merchants would come here, then they'd come and pick them up. So this was, in a very real sense, the hub of the community.
Most of the railway stations around Manitoba have closed. As train service began to dwindle, starting in the 1930s, intercity buses took their place. Today, very few buses remain in operation. We now rely almost entirely on personal cars and trucks to travel from place to place. The widespread abandonment of public transportation leaves some of us with no means to travel within our province.